A year ago, I published my first book, 100 Years of Universal Monster Movies, and I have a strong love for this franchise. I also thought about once in a while for some of these movies, or at least any of the movies in the 8-pack of VHS tapes I've had since I was a kid, and want to cover them when they have an anniversary or a newer movie coming out attached to them. Much of what I'm going to say is directly taken from my book, which I recommend checking out, as well as my newer book, Disney's live-action movie Bombs, 1979-2019. I would also like to thank my friend Antonia Carlotta, who is the great-grandniece of Universal founder Carl Laemmle Sr., for doing the foreword to my book. Anyway, enjoy the video and the history of this movie. Universal demanded a sequel to Frankenstein soon after that movie was a smashing success, but the development of the story did not start until much later. Around that time, Robert Florey, who initially was going to direct Frankenstein but was dropped in favor of James Whale, sent over his idea for a sequel titled The New Adventures of Frankenstein: The Monster Lives. But the studio had no interest in a 7-page treatment. By 1933, the studio decided to make a sequel that summer and wanted to call it The Return of Frankenstein. This would include bringing in many writers to come up with a worthy story to follow up Frankenstein. A writer that has been connected to this movie was R.C. Sheriff, who had previously written the screenplay for The Invisible Man and would be an uncredited writer on Dracula's Daughter. Although Sheriff denied ever working on this movie as a writer, some assume that he may have had little involvement to where he never finished a script draft. Regardless of his involvement or lack thereof, Sheriff's name has been attached to the movie for many years. The first confirmed writer that attempted to write a sequel that the studio brought on was Tom Reed, who had previously co-written the title Seeing the Phantom of the Opera, but did not get any screen credit for doing so. Then near the end of 1933, Lawrence G. Balchman was sent up to bat to take a swing at it, along with Phil McDonald to back him up. Reed turned his story treatment by June 10, 1933, then made 3 different screenplays by late July, with Balchman making his own story treatment by December 5th, and McDonald having a story treatment 36 pages in length ready the day after Christmas. Then, in 1934, John L. Balderson wrote a script version of which Balchman and McDonald wrote, and finished it on June 9, 1934, then rewriting it more until it was a 4th draft by July 23rd. Balderson had previously had his name attached to both stage versions of Dracula and Frankenstein that were adapted into movies by the studio, and written the screenplay for The Mummy. Years later, he would attempt to write a story treatment for Dracula's Daughter that would end up collecting dust. Aside from wanting Boris Karloff back to star in the movie, the studio wanted James Whale to return as the director, but Whale resisted. At the time, he felt like he did everything he could have done with the story, and thought the script or scripts the studio had scrapped together stunk. They then looked to Kurt Newman to direct for a brief time. Newman would be an uncredited writer on Dracula's Daughter with writing a story treatment. But then the studio offered Whale a sweet deal he couldn't refuse. It was that same month in which Whale's movie The Invisible Man was released. Ironically, it was the movie he accepted as an attempt to get the studio off his back to direct another Frankenstein movie. The following month, Whale changed his mind because of the sweet deal offer and agreed to direct the sequel. But he also wanted to talk to Philip McDonald to at least rewrite the script. This of course meant that Newman was out. It would not be the last time that Newman almost directed a Universal monster movie, where he almost directed Werewolf of London, with them being assigned to a different movie by the studio. Filming on the next Frankenstein movie would have started that same year, but Whale became unavailable by instead directing One More River for the studio. But the delay would benefit Whale and give him a hunger to return to the horror genre. With One More River being a critical and financial success, he gained more leverage to have more control over the project. Whale then consulted with Balderson and William Herbert on what he wanted the movie to be about. It was decided by the director and these writers to have this version take more advantage of the source material that it was based on. Unlike Frankenstein that had more in common with the stage version made in the 1920s, the sequel would be more faithful to the book Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. These men would double team this writing assignment, with Balderson working on the story aspects of it, and Herbert typing away at the screenplay. As for his thoughts on the other writers, Whale disapproved of Reed's script and the treatments that both Balchman and McDonald wrote. Balchman's story would have had the monster kill Baron Frankenstein, would cause the Frankenstein fortune to fall into ruin, and would terrorize the local countryside. This would then cause locals to become angry, and they turn their frustrations upon Henry and Elizabeth, with the couple escaping their wrath by joining a carnival that happens to be traveling around the area. The story was to end with the carnival lion getting loose and killing the monster before he can kill Henry and Elizabeth. McDonald's would have been more timely, with Henry creating a death ray for the League of Nations as a deterrent for another world war. But Henry by accident brings the monster back to life by testing the weapon in the foothills of the countryside. The monster attacks Henry, and the death ray ends up killing them both. A certain amount of time was to pass between the first movie, where Henry was now being married to Elizabeth and having a son with her. Reed would end up with at least some of his ideas making it into the final movie, including some aspects of the Frankenstein book. This would have included the blind hermit character and the monster wanting to mate. Whale himself went out of his way to turn down the violence in the script, favoring morality. He also wanted the violence to happen in the script to advance the story and the characters, rather than just because for the sake of action. By early 1934, it was decided by Carl Laemmle Sr. to give his son Carl Laemmle Jr. an independent unit of his own. Laemmle Jr. would oversee this, while only having to answer to his father. On his agenda was to finally make a sequel to Frankenstein to go into production as soon as possible. But then that same year, the Motion Picture Production Code went into effect that summer. Although it was around years beforehand, it was not until 1934 that it would be officially enforced. It was led by politician Will H. Hayes, which is why many refer to these regulations as the Hayes Code, and Joseph Green would be the administrator to oversee Hollywood movies. This was made possible due to the growing number of people who objected to the various depictions of mature and provocative content shown in movies. Although some studios attempted to police themselves prior to this within a decade due to public reactions, and how certain states would vary in what cuts were needed to allow a movie to be screened there in that state, the MPPC regulated the mature content to both satisfy members of the public that wanted to keep Hollywood's questionable depictions of their movies in check, and it lowered the number of cuts that were needed to screen a movie in a certain state. Although, its influence was limited in its country of origin, and overseas was a whole nother story. Because of concern that this new power would have an issue with the content of the current draft of the script, Hilbert rewrote it between October and November, and the final script was approved by the MPPC was done on December 1st. Among the other men that joined the squad of writers brought on to work on the script throughout development would be Joseph Brin, Morton Cobbin, and Edmund Pearson. But all these men would not receive any credit for their contribution. As for Pearson, he would not get any credit for his writing efforts on Werewolf of London. With negotiating to agree to direct the movie, James Whale wanted to have full creative control over it, as well as casting as many British actors as he could. A British actor that would obviously come back was Boris Karloff to reprise his role as the monster from Frankenstein. Because of the leverage he now had, Karloff demanded to have a few Saturdays off from the filming schedule. When he did, he would play cricket at a local country club. He also had the studio make him a special chair for him to rest in between scenes while standing up. This was usually labeled as the monster chair, and would be used by any actor who played the monster years later. This type of chair would even be used by the actors who played the Gill Man for the land scenes in the Creature movies in the 1950s. The final demand was to no longer wear the blue veil that he was forced to wear on his head while being escorted from the makeup room to the soundstage in order to not scare anyone. Karloff would go on to play his iconic role for the third and final time in Son of Frankenstein. Outside of playing the monster, Karloff had previously played the title character in The Mummy, and would later be in House of Frankenstein as Dr. Gustav Niemann as his final goodbye to the Frankenstein movies by Universal. The actor who played Henry Frankenstein from the previous movie would be back as well to help meet the director's British actor quota. What made Colin Clive eager to come back was being told that his character was going to be killed off at the end of this new movie, which was the fate he wished Henry would have had in Frankenstein before the ending was changed. Another actor who played Fritz in Frankenstein would come back, but Dwight Frye would play a different character named Carl, a character similar to Fritz. Interestingly enough, the character he played was supposed to be a few separate characters, with Carl being the village idiot, and Fritz being the henchman of the movie's new villain, and these characters would merge together. Frye played Renfield in Dracula, and a reporter in The Invisible Man. After this movie, Frye would later play a villager in The Ghost of Frankenstein, and Rudy in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. Whale had gathered a trio of actors from the previous movie to return. However, when it came to bringing back Henry's fiancée Elizabeth, Mae Clarke, who had played that character in Frankenstein, was noticeably absent, and was replaced by the much younger Valerie Hobson. The reason why she was replaced was that she was riddled with many misfortunes at that point of her life, from nervous breakdowns that were highly publicized, to failed relationships, and even getting into a car accident resulting in a broken jaw and some scars on her face that made her seen by the studio as damaged goods. As for Hobson, she was just several months signing into her 7-year-long contract with the studio, and they placed her in this movie. Around the same time she was 17 and playing Elizabeth in this movie, she would play a similar character in Werewolf of London as Lisa Glendon, but when filming on that movie finished, she had to go back to play Elizabeth in this movie for reshoots and had to put back on her $125 wig. Hobson liked the fact that she never had a moment alone to herself when working on this movie because she was in the company of at least another person, especially actors from the United Kingdom. Her impression of Karloff in the makeup was less of fear and more so of amazement. She was taken aback by the fact that this man she saw was so huge, but had a gentle lisp-sounding voice coming out of his mouth. She also got along well with Clive. Even though Clark was sad at the fact that she missed out on a sequel because of how good it turned out to be, she would still call herself the Bride of Frankenstein many years later. Speaking of, there was a rumor going around the studio on who was going to play the monster's mate, aka the Bride of Frankenstein, in the movie. Speculation spread that actresses such as Bridget Helm and Philip Brooks were considered to play this character, but this was all a smokescreen by the publicity department. An actress that was connected to the stunt was Arletta Duncan, who ironically played a bridesmaid in Frankenstein. The director only had Elsa Lanchester in mind when he discovered her in the 1920s over in London, where he's seen her perform in a few plays. The reason why he cast her was a similar reason why he picked Karloff to play the monster: her face. Another reason was that her husband, Charles Laughton, was already in Hollywood working on another movie, and she felt that was a good way to pass the time to be borrowed from her contract with MGM. For the movie's villain, Dr. Pretorius, there were early plans to have Bela Lugosi play this character. This would have happened if production had started in early 1934 as planned, but when production was delayed a whole year, Lugosi was no longer available. Claude Rains was briefly considered by Whale to play this character since he had worked with him on The Invisible Man, where he played that movie's title character. Then he changed his mind and decided to cast Ernest Selcher instead. Rains from The Invisible Man would not be in this movie, but a few other actors from that movie would be in this. These would include E. Clive, who had played Constable Jaffers as the Burgermeister, and Una O'Connor would play Jenny Hall, playing a similar character named Minnie. With the main cast picked, they would get paid a certain amount of money, depending on the number of weeks they would be needed to be in the movie, and for how big of a name they were at the time. On January 2nd, 1935, filming on The Return of Frankenstein began at Universal. On the cover page of the shooting script that was dated just a day and a month before filming began, it quoted the poem The Garden of Love by William Blake. The planned production budget was $293,750 on a schedule of 36 days. It would also be the first of many Universal monster movies that would be at the mercy of the newly enforced Motion Picture Production Code and had to answer to Joseph Breen. While other movies down the road would be easier for Breen to inspect as the rules would be better understood, this movie in particular will be put to the test in terms of edits done by the MPPC. The movie begins on a stormy night where inside a lavish estate, a young woman knits in the company of a few other men. This woman happens to be the author of Frankenstein, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, played by Elsa Lanchester, in the company of her husband Percy Bysshe Shelley, played by Douglas Walton, and their friend Lord Byron, played by Gavin Gordon. Lord Byron recaps the events from the previous movie as footage from Frankenstein plays, and Mary decides to tell these men the rest of the story. The actor who plays a victim that the monster kills in the recap was played by Torben Mayer, who would later play a gypsy in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. Part of the footage that recaps the events of the first movie is unused footage of the funeral procession walking over to the gravesite. But something that was mildly trimmed down in the scene was some of the moments that displayed the semi-revealing dress that Lanchester was wearing. There were also an issue with the lines that these characters had that boasted about their adulterous actions and infidelity that were cut. It may have been only the first scene of the movie, but there would be many more changes demanded to meet the standards of the MPPC. The dress that audiences did not see many angles of that Lanchester wore took 12 weeks for 17 women from Mexico to make, as the actress remembered. Lanchester may have been done with filming her scenes in this movie by February 20th. There was another role she would play in the movie. Outside the ruins of the windmill, the villagers celebrate defeating the monster. The happiest about this is Minnie, played by Una O'Connor, and the Burgermeister, played by E. Clive, tells her and the other villagers to go home. As Henry Frankenstein, played by Colin Clive, is taken back home, Hans, played by Reginald Barlow, wants to inspect the ruins to make sure that the monster is dead, but Hans's wife, played by Mary Gordon, cautions against it. Her husband then falls and lands into the water-filled cavern. Soon after he gets up, it turns out that the monster, played by Boris Karloff, survived the fire and kills Hans. The monster climbs up, and Hans's wife helps, thinking that it's her husband. When she sees the monster, she freaks out, and the monster throws her to her death. The monster then stumbles his way over to Minnie, and she runs away scared. The reason why there were reaction shots of an owl was that the MPPC thought that the intended reaction shots of the rat were seen as too offensive with audiences in the past. Hans's wife may have been killed off in the scene, but it would not be the last time the actress playing her would be in the Universal monster movies. She would later play an extra in The Invisible Man, Cookie in The Invisible Man Returns, Mrs. Bates in The Invisible Woman, and Jane in The Mummy's Tomb. Before this movie, she played a mourner in Frankenstein. As for Barlow, he would later play the caretaker Timothy in Werewolf of London, but Karloff got the worst in the scene. When the actor put on a rubber suit hidden underneath his costume to keep himself warm, air somehow got into the suit. When he was placed into the water, his legs flew upward, and he floated. While Karloff and the crew laughed at first, the laughter stopped when it was revealed that the actor dislocated a hip. Production was shut down because of this. But after being bandaged and strapped up inside the studio's infirmary, Karloff was back to work. For this movie, this is what Karloff's typical workday was like. It would start with him being woken up by his butler at 4:30 a.m., then he would take a cold shower and use an infrared light treatment for his hip. He would then have toast and coffee at 5:10 a.m. and would start driving to the studio 10 minutes later, which was 15 miles away. By 6 a.m., his face was prepped by a cosmetician who would oil, massage, and soothe his face for the makeup preparation. An hour later, Jack Pierce would start to put makeup on the actor. Hours later, and resting for a bit, he would be placed in a costume, padding inserted, and tall shoes with Pierce's assistants. By 1:30 p.m., he would have a sandwich and a cup of tea for lunch. A half hour later, he would arrive on set to film his scene or scenes for the day. A few hours after that, he would take a tea break and would be done filming by 7 p.m. An hour later, his costume and makeup were removed. After having another cold shower and a small dinner, he would drive back home and arrive around 8 p.m. By 8:30 p.m., he would be massaged and would shine infrared rays on his hip, and then by 9:30 p.m., he would go to bed with his copy of the script to read and call it a night. The major differences with the makeup from the first design was giving the monster a new scar on his right cheek, metal clips on the skull that were now exposed due to his hair being burnt off from the windmill fire, and a small stubble of hair that looked like as it was trying to grow back. Because Pierce put more details on Karloff's face, the makeup process took an hour and a half longer than the first movie, but it was not necessarily as long as the speculated 6 to 7 hours to put on. Also around that time, it was exaggerated how much the costume and makeup weighed. A contemporary source suggested that it was at least 45 pounds, and another thought it weighed up to 62 pounds, but this left out the factor of the costume accessories that the actor had to wear. On top of that, Karloff was under the protection of a few police officers that would escort him to and from the set, while also standing on guard on set and the dressing room. This reflected on how secretive the director was for how the makeup was done. He did this to keep the mystique of the monster to audiences. Henry is taken back home to his concerned fiancée Elizabeth, played by Valerie Hobson. When Henry is taken inside and is not moving, Elizabeth and the staff assume the worst. When Minnie returns, she tries to tell everyone that the monster is still alive, but the people do not believe her. She then shrieks when she sees Henry move his arm, and it turns out that he is alive. During the scene, it was speculated that when Clive was laying down when O'Connor screamed, the actor reacted by uttering a swear word, and is supposedly listenable in the movie's audio track, but this has never been proven to be true. The scene was also meant to be grimmer with the revelation that Henry's father, Baron Frankenstein, had died at the beginning of the movie, and therefore making Henry the new Baron. This is unknown why it was cut from the movie, and this was to happen to that character in the first movie within the script before the ending was changed. Regardless, Henry is later referred to as a Baron in this movie, even without an explanation. Now with Henry in bed to recover, and with Elizabeth alone with him, he talks about how even though he was almost killed by his own creation, he is still impressed by his discovery of how he created life. But Elizabeth does not want Henry to further this blasphemous work of his, and she is still traumatized by the monster. The iconic dress that Hobson wore in the scene before had her photographed in many times for publicity purposes. With her long wig on, she wore the bridal-like gown that was white satin in color and cost $700, but Hobson hated her iconic dress. She thought it was too heavy for her to move around practically, and did not like that it was made of satin. The heart-to-heart between these characters was Hobson's first day of filming. Director James Whale introduced them, but was blunt about getting things going. Clive could relate to his character for wanting to recover in this movie, because around that time when Karloff dislocated his hip, Clive fell and suffered a leg injury. This caused the actor to film much of his scenes sitting or lying down. When standing up in close-ups, the actor had to use crutches to keep himself up. When he had to stand up and walk in certain scenes, he had to use his acting skills to mask his pain. Not too long after, Minnie answers the front door, and it is Dr. Pretorius, played by Ernest Selzinger, who wants to see Henry at once. Minnie informs Henry, and Henry lets Dr. Pretorius in. The former professor of philosophy that Henry used to know back in his college days wishes to speak with him alone, and Elizabeth leaves. Dr. Pretorius asks Henry to work together to further this discovery of life. At first, Henry refuses, and rather wishes to get married as soon as he recovers. But when Dr. Pretorius tells him of his creation that he spent 20 years developing, Henry is interested, and decides to meet this man at home. In the meantime, as both women in the scene left these men to themselves, the actresses in their spare time would read a magazine scene, and sometimes O'Connor would knit in between scenes. Over at the home of Dr. Pretorius, he shows off his creations inside jars. These are his homulsi, and Henry thinks that this is more like the work of black magic than science. But Dr. Pretorius pitches the idea of making a female monster, and they can make it happen. Dr. Pretorius was not that important of a character in the script, but Weil decided to up the importance of the movie's villain. In addition, it was his idea to add the homulsi, the prologue scene, and to not have the sequel to be too tied to the first movie, and try to have this movie stand sort of separate. But some of the lines that the movie's villain was to say in the scene were either changed or cut. When Dr. Pretorius speaks of Bible stories, the script referred to them as if you are fond of your fairy tales, and was changed because the MPPC thought the original line was derogatory. As for the Lilliputian-like characters, they were made possible by a mix of big bottles and rear screen footage being projected. A member that is barely visible, but described as a little baby, was played by Billy Barty. The reason why his screen time was shortened was that it was seen as too ridiculous, which was a similar reason why O'Connor's screen time in the first act was cut out of concern that she could annoy audiences too much. Another deleted moment from this scene was to introduce a henchman of Dr. Pretorius named Carl, played by Dwight Fry, was to walk in on these men. He was to see these creatures, especially a devil-looking character that looks like his boss, and being freaked out as a result. But Fry's working relationship with the director was much better. Fry always got along with the director and often praised him. The next day inside a forest nearby, the monster drinks from a river and dislikes the reflection in it. Shortly after, a shepherdess, played by Anne Darling, is frightened by the sight of the monster and falls into the river. The monster saves her from drowning, but this young woman screams, and the monster attempts to quiet her down before a hunter, played by Robert Ader, shoots him to save the shepherdess. As for the actor who played the right man at the right time, Ader was previously in The Invisible Man as Detective Thompson. The actress who played the shepherdess in this movie was ordered by the director to change her white panties underneath to black ones. This change of clothing was applied to Hobson, where Well did not want her to wear any lingerie underneath her bridal-like gown she wore in the movie. Word spreads like wildfire that the monster is in the forest, and the villagers are led by the Burgermeister to capture the creature. After a standoff in the forest, the monster is tied to a pole by the villagers, and is hauled to a prison to be strapped down in imprisonment. But the monster breaks out by sheer strength. Enraged, the monster goes on a rampage. This was filmed in the European village set that was used in Frankenstein and many later Universal monster movies. As for the various actors who played some of the villagers in this movie, some were either in some or would later be featured in a Universal monster movie later on. Mae Bruce was in Frankenstein as the Screaming Maid, Walter Breen was the bicycle owner that gets his property stolen in The Invisible Man, and Grace Cunard would later be in The Mummy's Tomb as the farmer's wife. Murdoch McCreary was also in a mummy movie for the studio as a temple priest in The Mummy's Hand. Among them that topped them all in terms of quantity of appearance was John George. He was in The Hunchback of Notre Dame as an extra, and was a scientist in Dracula, with the footage featured of him being shown in the Spanish version of Dracula as well. But there was meant to be more drama seen in this village that would end up on the cutting room floor. This was partially out of the demands from the MPPC that had an issue with the close to a dozen moments of the monster killing people by either strangling them to death or running them over, among other characters in the movie killing people. The demise of the Burgermeister was to be shown where the monster happens to be looking over through a window and breaks through to grab and kill this man shortly after. However, not all the footage was cut due to censorship, but rather by the choice of the movie's director. For example, a scene of the villagers visiting the morgue was cut simply because the set era that had dated 1869 on it, and there was concern that the date could confuse the audience on when the movie takes place. Whale wanted this movie to be timeless without having a date tied to it, so this is why this scene was cut. The lengthiest piece of footage that was left out was a subplot involving Carl killing his uncle Glutz for his money, and Carl blames the monster for the murder to the villagers. This also involved a scene of Carl attending a town meeting with the Burgermeister talking to everyone about what just happened inside a courtroom were cut because it slowed down the movie and did not contribute to much of the story at hand. D.R.C. Corrigan was in this meeting scene as a procession leader, and he previously played a villager in The Invisible Man. J. Guinness Davis as Uncle Glutz and Temple Pidgeot as Aunt Glutz were left out of the movie, but both would be in Werewolf of London, with Davis playing a detective and Pidgeot playing a drunk woman. That night, the monster intrudes on a gypsy camp and tries to take their food out of hunger, but the monster burns his hand from the fire. This moment was a reshoot because the footage that was cut from earlier in the movie. It would explain why this moment of the movie doesn't have any music since it was shot close to the release date. The monster walks near a cabin and is attacked attracted by hearing music coming from it. He barges in and finds a blind hermit, played by O.B. Heggie, but this old man is not afraid and instead tends to the monster's wounds. The hermit feeds the monster and lays him down. He proclaims the monster as his friend and prays to God to thank him. This tender moment and the next scene featuring this character was described in the script as an old man with a beard, but not quite 75 yet, caused a production delay on week 8 of filming due to Heggie working on another movie for a different studio at the time. The edit of the crucifix on the wall that stands out during the fade to black transition was the idea of the movie's editor Ted J. Kent, credited as Ted Kent, and Well was unaware of this until the movie was complete for a release. Kent previously edited The Invisible Man. He would later be an editor on Son of Frankenstein, The Wolfman, The Ghost of Frankenstein, and Creature from the Black Lagoon. The next morning, the hermit teaches the monster how to talk, how to drink from a cup, and how to smoke. This was the first of a few movies by Universal in which the monster would talk, but this was a creative decision that Karloff strongly disliked, even if his character did talk in the book that the movie was based on. But the friendship is intruded by a few lost hunters, played by John Carradine and Frank Terry, ask for directions and freak out when they discover the monster. Against the hermit trying to convince these men that the monster is his friend, the lost hunters attack the monster. The monster fights back, resulting in the hermit's home catching on fire. The monster escapes, and the lost hunters help the hermit to safety. Aside from the monster, the other character that stands out in the scene is a lost hunter because he is a recognizable face within the Universal monster movies. Carradine was previously in The Invisible Man as an informant calling the police. Carradine would later play Dr. Peter Dory in The Invisible Man's Revenge, Yusuf Bey in The Mummy's Ghost, and Dracula in both House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. The friendship between the monster and the hermit was not as good compared to Karloff's working relationship with Whale. Whale was usually nasty to Karloff, more so during this movie. Whale also envied the fact that Karloff got more attention than he did. When they were being professional, Karloff and Whale would usually talk to figure out what to do with the scene. Karloff was so softly spoken that anyone else was hard-pressed to eavesdrop on what he was saying to the director. The monster makes his way to a graveyard, and after pushing over a statue, the monster makes his way into a crypt underground to hide from the villagers. Within this scene, there was meant to be a moment of the monster pulling a statue of Jesus Christ off the cross, thinking that was someone like him in pain, but it was cut due to potentially being sacrilegious. Before this, the monster scares some kids after leaving the home of the hermit. Among the kids, the most well-known of the bunch was Marilyn Harris, who played Little Maria in Frankenstein. Despite the fact that this character was drowned by the monster, Harris and the other kids were not frightened of Karloff, but were far more comfortable around him than the adults were. They would interact with him by touching the padding of his legs and lifting his big shoes to figure out how much of this character he was playing was real and how much was fake. Within the crypt, the monster finds a dead body of a young woman in a coffin. His attention to the corpse is interrupted when he hides from a trio of men entering the crypt. This is Dr. Pretorius leading his henchmen Carl and Rudy, played by Neil Fitzgerald, and he orders them to take out a dead body of a woman. After these men leave, Dr. Pretorius eats, smokes, and drinks. The monster approaches him, but Dr. Pretorius is friendly to the monster just as the hermit was. He offers him food and drink, and the monster wants to have a friend, in which Dr. Pretorius agrees to. The crypt set was the same in Dracula, and some of the tombstones and crosses seen in the graveyard were also reused from Frankenstein. Dr. Pretorius then visits Henry again and insists on them creating a female, but Henry refuses. The monster kidnaps Elizabeth under the orders of Dr. Pretorius, convincing Henry to create a female monster. The moment the monster is stalking Elizabeth before kidnapping the unsuspecting woman was a reshoot. It was John L. Balderson's idea for the monster to demand a mate, and kidnapping Elizabeth to force Henry to do so. He also wanted to have a scene earlier where the monster is a peeping Tom seeing a married peasant couple named Eric and Hilda kiss, undress, and fall into their bed. This was borrowed from an idea that Robert Florey had for his version of Frankenstein, but the MPPC objected to this because it was deemed as too sexual, and it was removed before it was filmed. Even though the phrase "the monster demands a mate" was commonly used when the time came for marketing the movie, the MPPC had the line changed from mate to friend in the movie. Dr. Pretorius may have been a menace to Elizabeth in this movie, but Hobson liked the actor playing him. As the monster places a tied-up Elizabeth inside a nearby cave, Henry and Dr. Pretorius work away at making a mate for the monster. When they need a fresh female heart, Carl goes to the village to kill a random woman for her heart. But an early draft of the script written by William Herbert was to have Carl kill Elizabeth to use her heart for the monster's mate, and this moment was filmed. But it was seen by the studio as too dark, and it was altered to have a random woman, as well as for Elizabeth be freed by the monster. Other things that were changed were to call the insides instead of entrails that described body parts, and to not show any close-up shots of the heart inside the jar. The monster grows impatient and harasses a tired Henry. Dr. Pretorius handles him by tricking the monster into drinking drugged alcohol, and the monster goes to sleep. Clive was more reserved and less energetic in this movie compared to the first movie. This could have been a side effect of the actor's alcoholism affecting him. As for the monster drink in this movie, George D. McNormand, who was Karloff's stuntman in this movie, was invited into the actor's dressing room and was given a hard drink. Karloff thought the man would need this because of how painful it was when the time came to remove the fake headpiece and the scars. While there were various mishaps of the leading men injuring themselves and stress with many people working on the movie, the production was generally fun for the whole cast, where the actors would take a tea break each day of filming. When things are finally ready, the monster's maid is lifted to the roof for lightning to bring her to life. Another lackey of Dr. Pretorius named Ludwig, played by Ted Billings, joins Carl on the roof. This actor was a villager in Frankenstein. Billings played a villager playing a game of darts in The Invisible Man, and later in The Invisible Man's Revenge as a bettor in the local pub. But the monster wakes up and looks around on the roof. Carl tries to stop the monster from interfering with the process, and the monster kills Carl by throwing him off the roof just before the lightning strike charges up the corpse. The laboratory set in this movie was 70 feet tall. This and many impressive sets for the production cost $37,500 to make, while the sequence and the whole movie was shot by cinematographer John G. Mescal, who earned a pay of $2,500 a week on giving this movie a unique visual style. The body is lowered, and the bandages and the eyes are removed to reveal that there is now life in this female creation. This dramatic shot of the creation's eyes revealing life was going to be in Frankenstein when the monster comes to life, but was changed to show a right arm movie instead. After unwrapping her head and placing her in a surgical bridal-like gown, the monster's mate, played by Elsa Lanchester, is proclaimed by Dr. Pretorius as
the Bride of Frankenstein.
The iconic look of this character was anything but glamorous for Lanchester. She got up from the Garden of Allah hotel where she was staying at to go to work and arrived at 5 a.m. Unlike many other monster makeup creations, Pierce only had Lanchester come in a few times for a makeup test since he already knew what he wanted her to look like. Queen Nefertiti of ancient Egypt. For the face, a scar was placed underneath her chin that took an hour to place on, with a few lines of glue, with a red line drawn in the middle, then with white edges for the scar in high detail. The scar that was not seen much in the movie was made of pink putty, red paint, and spirit gum. Then he would work on her eyebrows and her hair. What was seen in the movie was Lanchester's real auburn hair. It was lifted with several small and tight braids placed inside a horseshoe cage that stood at nearly 5 inches, and it was combed over the cage. The final touch was gray streaks of hair pieces brushed on. After the face and hair were done, the actress was wrapped in yards upon yards by a nurse employed by the studio. To make her look taller than she was, the 5'4" actress stood on stilts to increase her height by at least several inches. This transformation took at least 3 hours and sometimes 4 hours to do, but an issue she had with the makeup process was her interactions with the man who put the stuff on her. Because the bandages made it difficult for her to move around, Lanchester needed to be carried around a few times to the lounge of wicker chairs. She would have tea with her untied feet, but she made sure not to drink too much since it would be a hassle to go to the bathroom with her bandages and costume on. The monster walks into the laboratory and falls in love with this woman, but when he tries to show affection, she screams in fear and rejects him. The monster could have used the advice of the actress's husband, Charles Laughton, who told the actor the following. The personality of the monster's mate was a mixture of wild animal held captive, but with a weird sense of dignity. Lanchester was told to act with an unnatural wide-eyed look without blinking. Since it was painful for her, it made her look scarier, and the director would usually yell cut just before she gave in to the need to blink her eyes. If that was not enough, the actress had to hiss, which was inspired by the ways that swans sound off in anger, but she suffered a sore throat by doing all the hissing and screaming in the movie for multiple takes for different camera angles. This resulted in Lanchester not speaking well for days, and had briefly lost her voice. Codeine was an opiate pain reliever that she would use to help her throat pain. The monster gets angry and makes his way to a self-destruct lever. At the same time, a freed Elizabeth shows up to try to enter the laboratory to save Henry. The monster decides to let Henry go to live with Elizabeth, but concludes that everyone else, including himself, needs to die. The tower then blows up when the monster pulls the lever, with Henry and Elizabeth running out to safety. The monster's mate could change the monster's mind about destroying them all if she would have done what the actress playing her did to the crew. According to Whale's friend Curtis Harrington, the director told him that basically she flashed them. But this was not the ending that the director had in mind, nor was it the original ending that was filmed. The movie was to end with everyone, including the innocent Elizabeth, dying inside the tower. But seeing this, the studio overruled Whale and had the ending changed for Henry and Elizabeth to have a happy ending. Since the laboratory explosion would have been too costly to do again, and with the movie already going over budget, they reused the laboratory explosion, despite the fact that Henry is visible inside the room when it gets destroyed. Clive was greatly disappointed that the studio changed the ending, but an early draft of the script would have been far darker than what was filmed. Balderson's rough draft was far more violent and gruesome. In pure rage, the monster was to kill Henry, Elizabeth, and his mate. It was intended by the writer for this to strengthen the tragedy of the moment, and for the monster to die not too long after by being struck by lightning because of praying for death. But Whale knew that if the monster killed these characters, especially someone as innocent as Elizabeth, any sympathy that audiences would have felt for the monster would have disappeared. This movie finished on March 7th, 1935, going 10 days over schedule and way over budget at $397,023.79. But in the middle of filming, the title was changed to The Return of Frankenstein to Bride of Frankenstein. During post-production, Franz Waxman worked away on the movie's soundtrack and would break the record that The Mummy had for the soundtrack's runtime in the Universal monster movies. Whale offered Waxman the chance to make a soundtrack that would utilize his reliance on instruments that were electrical in nature and that made echo effects. He eagerly agreed to do so, and ended up using a symphony orchestra to perform the movie's soundtrack, which was an early usage for a movie. Most of the music was his own work. Ave Maria by Franz Schubert was basically the song that the hermit plays in the violin, and Danse Macabre by Camille Saint-Saëns was the theme for Dr. Pretorius. Before its release, the movie was screened to a test screen audience. After it was shown to that audience in early April, various cuts were made by the people making the movie and various producers at the studio. They trimmed down the first scene with Mary Shelley's character, the part where Carl sees the little people that his boss made, the moment the Burgermeister being pulled out of the window by the monster untying Elizabeth, and the entire subplot involving Carl and his uncle. Lanchester wished that her screen time wearing her lavish dress in the first scene of the movie would have been shown off more due to her loving it so much. But even with these cuts, it was decided to not cut many of the moments that the MPPC advised cutting. The following was asked to be cut, but ended up in the movie. At least 15 minutes worth of footage was left out of the final movie, with some suggestions of the studio and the MPPC to cut out 17 minutes worth. Ultimately, the deleted scenes that are still missing were deleted because they wanted to show the monster sooner and the worry about boring audiences with too much talking from the cast. The movie was given a screening to the press inside a small projection room within Universal's grounds. These critics that were given an early screening, and the critics that watched the movie when it was released to the public, loved it. They praised the technical aspects and the acting from the cast, most notably Boris Karloff's portrayal as the monster. But even with this blessing from this influential group, Carl Laemmle Jr. was not a fan about the movie, nor was John L. Balderson was dissatisfied with how it turned out. Even with these mixed feelings that the people involved with the movie had, they still had to go full speed ahead and marketing it to the public. Movie theaters across the country started marketing it a month in advance to ride up the hype of the first movie created. The studio had various things in mind for marketing, with ideas either being reused from previous Universal monster movie releases, or by fresh ideas by the studio's marketing employee, Joe Well. These included signs and a chain strapped to a local pole outside the theater. There was also a shadow box with a poster of Valerie Hobson as Elizabeth inside the bars outside of it. Question marks would be around her to ask if she was the real Bride of Frankenstein to anyone who would see this. There were drawing contests, makeup contests, doorknob hangers with the title of the movie on it, and a cardboard of the monster's face that would speak to people, with a man on a microphone speaking on the other side. A window display of a recreation of Henry Frankenstein's laboratory with a mannequin on a surgical table, and another mannequin in a bridal gown next to it was placed on display. A truck hauling around an elaborate cardboard display of some of the actors' faces on it, with sound bites being transmitted from a man in the passenger seat. In major cities across the country, the dress that Elsa Lanchester wore in the beginning of the movie was on display, and people would get a better look at the details of the dress than they would from watching the movie. A novelization of the movie was written by Michael Egmont, but would not be published until a year later. A common marketing tactic that the studio would encourage would have an ambulance outside of movie theaters, with nurses standing by inside the lobby. A movie theater in New York City got the idea to stage a nervous breakdown on the movie's opening day. This involved local and unknown actresses pretend to be scared when the movie played for the first showing around noon to be escorted out by a real nurse, and an actor playing an intern wait inside a booth.
What are you doing in here?
I'm having a nervous breakdown.
The Key Theater in that same city took advantage of the ambulance-like gimmick by hiring Larry Schamberger to dress like a doctor in a surgical gown. He was paid to prevent the urge to crack a smile to anyone who came across at various street corners hauling around a dummy on a mobile stretcher made to look like a real person, while also wearing odd-looking makeup. Then in New Haven, Connecticut, movie theater manager Harry Black got the idea to have a dummy attached to light bulbs, buzzers, and mummy-like bandages that would go off with electricity. Movie theater manager Bud Summers from Indiana did something similar with a skeleton placed on an operating table inside his lobby, and in that same state, a man walked around wearing a cardboard advertisement for the movie that alluded to the publicity attempt of a live surgical operation. Other ideas from other managers would be less controversial, such as offering money to around $5 or some other prize of having the nerve to watch the movie all by themselves during a late screening. On Easter weekend, Bride of Frankenstein premiered at the Hollywood Pageant Theater on April 20th, 1935. This theater had so many people demanding to see it that it would be played up to 11 times within a single day. For admission to the Roxy Theater in New York City, which has showings that would charge 25 cents for early matinee showings and 10 cents more for regular late showings, it made $40,500. This is great news for that theater since the Raldo Theater ended up rejecting it. Over in the country of Australia in the Plaza Theater in Sydney, a late night screening close to midnight would charge 50 cents per ticket that would include a screening of the movie along with a staged wedding. The financial success of this movie was swell for the studio, and the cherry on top would be earning an Academy Award nomination for Best Sound, thanks to Gilbert Kirtland's work on it. It was more than just the studio that was happy with how the movie turned out. Some of the actresses of the movie reflected fondly on Bride of Frankenstein. Hobson loved working on it because everyone there was nice to her. Even many years later, Kizzo recognized Lanchester instantly in person. But despite all the critical and financial success, Bride of Frankenstein would also gain controversy like its predecessor. Even with a disclaimer playing before the movie to let audiences know that it was given approval by the Motion Picture Production Code, some states throughout America would have their issues with it. The things that would be cut would either be a line or so of dialogue. In Pennsylvania, the line that Dr. Pretorius says about creating life was cut, and the state of Ohio did the same, as well as cutting out a line that Carl says about saying that the heart he got for the monster's mate was fresh. But in the just mentioned state, the studio's branch manager Paul Kringer in Cincinnati thought the studio had rushed the movie for censor B.O. Skinner to inspect for a release over there. Skinner reviewed the movie again and decided to cut the moment of the little girl's dead body being found. Although the states of Kansas, Massachusetts, and New York had no issues with the movie's content, but the situation was messier overseas. In England, the moment the monster in the crypt looking upon the dead body of the young woman was cut over concerns of necrophilia, but the city of Birmingham outright banned the movie from being screened there, among other cities and towns in that country. Sweden wanted the movie to be cut and ended up cutting it 27 times. Hungary said no to it. The reason was that they objected to the fact the monster created by science was used to commit various crimes. Over in other countries outside of Europe, China cut the moment of the monster and the dead woman and various violent scenes in the movie. Palestine would concur with Hungary by saying no to showing the movie in their country. So anyway, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.